Hi class, welcome to your lecture on Harris and Freeman. You'll hear the Song of the South, Zippity Doo Dah playing in the background. Song of the South is the full-length feature film that is a compilation of the Brer Fox and Brer Rabbit stories, some of which you read in our textbook, that are narrated by Uncle Remus. And I wanted to include Harris and Freeman together because they are both writers using local color fiction, which is a type of regionalism that showcases customs and dialects and ways of different parts of the country. So you'll see that Harris writes about the South, Freeman writes about New England, and we've already talked about how Mark Twain is more, his stories are more focused in the western part of the country, as are Bret Harte's stories that you're going to read one of them in our textbook for this module. Anyway, there was some controversy, of course, surrounding the publication of these stories because supposedly they depicted slavery in a negative way. This movie, Song of the South, was actually banned for this very reason. However, if you pay attention to the characters and the fact that the rabbit, though weaker, supposedly outsmarts the fox, you'll see that what is being shown is that the cunning and the wit is more powerful than the physical strength. So that's also apparent in other cartoons. I included an excerpt from a Coyote and Roadrunner cartoon, and you might also see this in Bugs Bunny and in Sylvester and Tweety. Joel Chandler Harris grew up with his mom because his dad deserted them when he was born, and he began working for a newspaper at the age of 14, contributing in little pieces. Eventually, his mom and he moved to the newspaper owner's plantation in Georgia, where he was introduced to Negro slaves and listened to their folklore and committed their dialect and their stories to memory. He began publishing the story of Uncle Remus in columns of the Atlanta Constitution, which modeled his life as a 7-year-old boy when he and his mom lived on that plantation together. And so what you're going to look for in this story is the symbol, and note that even though the fox is stronger than the rabbit uses its wisdom to outwit the fox. And so I want to just leave you with those thoughts on Harris and move over to Freeman and tell you a little bit about her situation. She grew up in poverty up in New England and around a lot of loss. She lost her couple of siblings and her father, and she was also raised by a Congregationalist. And I don't know, I'm no expert on world religions. However, I wanted to give you a little brief overview of what Congregationalism is about. It's based on Calvinism, and you might remember that Calvinists believe that any ruin that you encounter in your life is caused by sin. And branching off of that are the Puritans, who were a group of radical Protestants who believed that there were pagan influences in the church that needed to be eradicated. So they went on the witch hunts and killed witches, and you might remember the Scarlet Letter by Hawthorne was written about this particular time and group of people. And then eventually you get to the Congregationalists, which were, and she was, being raised in this kind of family, she was subjected to a strict code of behavior, and these constraints that were put on her and the effect of those constraints on her behavior become one of the chief subjects of her stories. Poverty was especially difficult for people who were raised with Puritan beliefs because their Puritan heritage led them to think that their poverty was a punishment for their sin. Like many female writers of the time, she couldn't be as straightforward as she wanted to with her thoughts and themes, so she used the ghost story as a means of examining the social, personal, and economic pressures of women. And that becomes a theme that is apparent. You'll see if you've read, or you need to have read, The Revolt of Mother by her. You'll see that theme of women and how they're oppressed and how they act out against that. A couple of other interesting things that I found when I was researching her. Her neighbors did not like her because they oftentimes saw themselves in not favorable ways in the characters in her stories. Another thing that I read about her is that oftentimes the endings of her stories disappoints and trouble students because sometimes they're linear, and I want you to know the difference between linear, comic, and tragic resolutions. With a linear ending, the situation remains unchanged, whereas with a tragic ending, of course, you have something that happens at the end that is not favorable, and then with a comic resolution, you have the ending is favorable, not necessarily funny. So in the Revolt of Mother, like in other examples of stories that use regionalism, there is an absence of a narrator. So that we found that also last week when we were looking at the stories of Stephen Crane. The characters' voices create their own stories, and which means it uses a third-person omniscient narrator, where the narrator is detached and has an objective point of view. A couple of other things I want you to think about when looking at the story. I want you to look at the title, and I want you to consider why the word mother is in quotation marks. I also want you to look at the word revolt and think about it. At one point, it is said that Freeman quoted that all fiction ought to be true. Well, she said that there was no way that the story, The Revolt of Mother, could be true because this mother could never have been real. If she had been a real person, she, during this time period, would have lacked the nerve and the imagination to do what she did. And so that's why mother is in quotation marks. Also, in the story, The Revolt of Mother, as in New England Nun, which is another story by Freeman with which you might be familiar, we see women asserting control over their own domestic situations. And this is a pervasive theme in Freeman's writing. Two themes that I want you to think about. One is their inner world and the power that they have inside, but the constrictions and the limitations for using that power socially. So there's that conflict, and it becomes an internal conflict and it becomes an external conflict. The second theme that I want you to look for is that of poverty, and I've just mentioned earlier that poverty was seen as a form of punishment for not being strong enough in faith, and that is seen oftentimes in her stories as well. So I'd like for you to read the selections. You can't click on the selections on the Moodle site and get to the links because they're actually in your textbook, and I will put the page numbers out there at some point, but you need to read those selections that I've added to Writing Assignment 1. And your assessment this week is to turn in your first writing assignment. I want you to take it really seriously. I want you to pay attention to the claims you're making and to the ways that you're presenting those claims and to your conventions and your mechanics, your grammar, your punctuation, your spelling. Look at your organization and do the very best job you can do with this writing assignment. And I will see you next week unless you have any questions, and you can always call me or email me. And have a great weekend. Thanks.